The courthouse doors had barely swung shut behind us when my former mother-in-law stepped directly into my path. She planted the tip of her cane on the concrete outside the Hamilton County Courthouse in Noblesville, Indiana, and looked at me with the same expression she'd worn for years whenever she wanted me to feel small. "Don't ever set foot in my house again," Lorraine snapped loudly enough for people walking by to hear. "Get out." My ex-husband Mark stood a few feet behind her in his tailored navy suit. He folded his arms across his chest and smirked, as if the divorce judge had just handed him the greatest victory of his life. I adjusted the strap of my worn leather purse and took a slow breath. The migraine that had been building behind my right eye since dawn pulsed again. Then I smiled. "Actually, Lorraine," I said quietly, "the sale closed this morning." She frowned. "What sale?" "I sold the house." Her face barely changed before I added one more sentence. "And your son isn't the CEO anymore." For 2 full seconds, nobody spoke. Then Mark laughed, not a nervous laugh, but a loud, confident one that turned a few heads on the courthouse steps. "Diane," he said, shaking his head, "you've always had quite an imagination." Lorraine laughed too. "You really think anyone believes that?" I didn't answer. There was nothing left to explain, not yet. Instead, I reached into my purse, pulled out a small envelope, and handed it toward Lorraine. "These are the instructions from the attorney. You have 72 hours to remove your personal belongings." She didn't even take the envelope. Mark stepped forward. "You've officially lost your mind." Maybe he believed that. Or maybe he needed to, because if he admitted even for a second that I wasn't bluffing, everything he'd believed about the last 25 years would come crashing down. 6 months earlier, I never imagined I'd be standing outside a courthouse saying those words. Back then, I was still trying to save a marriage that had quietly disappeared years before I realized it. People always ask when a marriage ends. In my experience, it isn't one big moment, it's hundreds of little ones. It was Mark stopping by my office only when he needed a signature. It was eating dinner alone 3 nights a week, because another client meeting ran late. It was him introducing himself at company events without ever mentioning me. The worst one happened at the Indiana Manufacturing Leadership Awards in downtown Indianapolis. Our company, Carter Precision Systems, had just received an award for 25 years in business. I sat at table 12 wearing a dark green dress I'd owned for nearly 10 years. Nothing fancy, I was never much for expensive clothes. Mark walked onto the stage. He looked confident, comfortable, like he'd rehearsed every word. "I started Carter Precision Systems with nothing more than a dream," he told the audience. People applauded. "I worked every day to build this company into what it is today." More applause. I waited. Surely he'd mention the people who actually kept the company alive, our employees, his late father, maybe me. "Thank you all for believing in my vision." That was it. I smiled politely because everyone else was smiling, but inside, something hurt. Not because I needed applause, but because I'd spent 25 years making sure payroll went out every Friday. I'd refinanced our home during the recession. When cash flow nearly collapsed in 2009, I called suppliers myself and begged for another 30 days. I remembered sitting in our tiny office with stacks of unpaid invoices, while my father quietly slid an envelope across the desk. He'd sold part of his farmland near Lafayette, $320,000, everything he'd saved after my mother died. He looked at me and simply said, "If you believe this company can survive, then so do I." That money didn't buy us luxury, it bought us time. Time became survival, survival became growth, and growth became the company Mark now called his alone. A week after the awards banquet, I noticed something else. Mark stopped wearing his wedding ring. Not always, only when he traveled. I said nothing. By then, silence had become easier than arguments. Then one Tuesday evening, he came home carrying a folder. I was heating leftover chicken soup, because my migraine had been bothering me all afternoon. He laid the folder beside my bowl. "I've already signed." I looked down. Divorce papers. No warning, no conversation, just signatures waiting for mine. "I think this is best," he said. I kept staring at the papers. "What happened to us?" He sighed impatiently. "Diane, we've been roommates for years." I nodded slowly. Maybe that part was true. But roommates don't erase each other. He leaned against the kitchen counter. "I've talked with my attorney. I'll make sure you're comfortable financially." Comfortable? After 25 years. I finally looked at him. "What do you think I contributed to this company?" He actually looked surprised by the question. "You handled spreadsheets." Just 4 words, you handled spreadsheets. Nothing about negotiating loans. Nothing about keeping employees insured. Nothing about sitting beside hospital beds after workplace injuries. Nothing about missing vacations because someone had to stay behind. Just you handled spreadsheets. He picked up his keys. "I have dinner with Natalie." I assumed he hadn't meant to say her name out loud, though he didn't correct himself. After the front door closed, I sat there alone until the soup turned cold. I wasn't crying, not yet. I was trying to understand how someone could live beside me for 25 years and genuinely believe I'd simply organized paperwork. 2 days later, I met Rachel Kim. She'd served on our board for years and had become one of the few people I trusted completely. We met at a quiet coffee shop near Meridian Street in Indianapolis. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she stirred her coffee once. "What do you want?" I expected legal advice. Instead, she asked that. "I don't know." "Yes, you do." I looked out the window. "I want him to stop pretending I never existed." Rachel nodded. Then she asked a question that caught me completely off guard. "Did you sign this year's voting proxy?" I blinked. "No. I forgot." Rachel smiled for the first time all morning. "No?" She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a thick corporate binder. "You remembered exactly when you needed to." She opened it carefully before sliding it across the table. "Turn to page 32. I frowned. "What am I looking for?" Rachel folded her hands. "The reason Mark may have made the biggest mistake of his career." I stared at page 32 for several seconds before looking back up. The page wasn't dramatic, no bold headlines, no secret clause highlighted in yellow. Just a chart, boxes, names, numbers, and corporate language I'd spent half my life reading. "I don't understand," I admitted. Rachel turned the binder toward herself and tapped the page with one finger. "You own 38 of the company's equity." "I know, but that's not what matters here. Your Class A preferred shares carry 5 votes each." I nodded slowly. "I remember Dad insisting on that." "So do I," Rachel leaned back. "Mark remembers, too." That surprised me. "I thought you were about to tell me he'd forgotten." She shook her head. "No, that would make this story too easy." She smiled faintly. "Mark didn't forget. He got comfortable." That sentence stayed with me. 4 years, every annual shareholders meeting followed the same routine. A few weeks beforehand, Mark's assistant would email me a proxy authorization. I'd sign it, Mark would vote my shares, the meeting would end, and life would go on. "I trusted him," I said quietly. Rachel nodded. "And he came to believe trust was permanent." She slid another document across the table. "This year's proxy, it was blank, unsigned." "You never sent it back?" "No." Rachel looked directly at me. For the first time in 17 years, Mark doesn't control your votes. I sat there without speaking. Outside, a delivery truck backed into the alley behind the coffee shop. Someone laughed near the counter. Life kept moving, but mine had suddenly shifted on its axis. Rachel continued gently. When your father invested in Carter Precision Systems 15 years ago, he didn't write Mark a check. He invested in you. Exactly. I smiled for the first time in weeks. Dad had never disliked Mark. He simply believed business and marriage were two different things. If this company ever survives because of my money, he'd said back then, I want everyone to remember where that money came from. Rachel had been the young attorney who drafted the agreement. Each Class A share carried 5 votes. They couldn't be converted without my written consent, nor could they be diluted without my approval. Back then, none of us imagined the company would someday be worth more than $100 million. We were just trying to make payroll. So, what happens now? I asked. Rachel didn't answer immediately. That depends on why you're asking. What do you mean? If you're trying to punish your husband for having an affair, she let the sentence hang, then don't do this. I blinked. I wouldn't. I know, she looked relieved. But if you're trying to protect a company whose leadership has stopped acting in its employees' best interests. She closed the binder. That's a different conversation. Over the next few weeks, divorce mediation moved forward. Everything became paperwork, financial statements, property valuations, retirement accounts, insurance policies. 25 years of marriage reduced to folders with colored tabs. Mark was polite whenever lawyers were present, almost cheerful. It was strange. He treated the divorce like a business transaction he'd already won. During one mediation session, our attorneys reviewed the marital property. The old Carmel house came up. It had belonged to my parents before they passed away. Although it had become part of the marital estate for settlement purposes, it also needed expensive repairs. The roof was nearing the end of its life, the original windows leaked every winter, and the plumbing was ancient. Mark barely looked at the appraisal. I don't want it. His attorney glanced at him. You sure? I have no interest in maintaining that place. He turned toward me. You always liked old houses. I said nothing. He wanted something else instead, the downtown Indianapolis condo, most of our brokerage account, his boat, and several investment accounts. His lawyer quietly rearranged the numbers. By the end of the afternoon, Mark had formally agreed to waive any future claim to the Carmel house as part of the settlement package. He looked pleased with himself. Walking out to the parking lot, I heard him tell his attorney, I got the better deal. Maybe he believed that. At home, Lorraine had already started acting like I no longer lived there. One Thursday afternoon, I came back from a doctor's appointment. The arthritis in 2 fingers of my right hand had been bothering me again. When I stepped inside, cardboard boxes filled the front hallway. One box had a thick black marker label across it, Donate. I knelt carefully and opened it. On top sat my parents' wedding photograph. Beneath it lay Dad's old pocket knife, my mother's handwritten recipe cards, and an album filled with photographs from the first years of Carter Precision Systems, our first rented garage, Mark covered in machine grease, and me holding Emily with one arm while answering payroll calls with the other. One photograph had been bent across the corner. I gently flattened it. Lorraine walked in carrying grocery bags. Oh? She didn't sound embarrassed. I figured Mark wouldn't want all that old clutter. I looked up. My parents aren't clutter. She sighed dramatically. Don't start. You'll be moving soon anyway. She set the groceries on the counter. There's no reason to drag useless memories around forever. I carefully closed the album. Those weren't memories to me, they were proof, proof that I had been there from the beginning. That evening, while carrying laundry upstairs, I heard Lorraine talking on the phone. She didn't know I was home. I told Natalie she'd love this kitchen once they remodel it, she said, pausing. Oh, absolutely. She laughed. The cabinets are ancient. We'll finally make this house look modern. I quietly walked back downstairs before she noticed me. Not because I was afraid, but because I suddenly realized she wasn't imagining a future where I still existed. The following Monday, my phone rang. It was Tom Alvarez, our outside CPA. He almost never called me directly. Diane, his voice sounded unusually serious. Do you have a few minutes? I do. I've been reviewing executive compensation. Something about his tone made me sit down. I found several things Rachel needs to see. What kind of things? He lowered his voice. Large executive retention bonuses. That's not unusual. These were approved without full board review. I frowned. Anything else? A resort trip listed as a vendor conference. Silence. One hotel room. I didn't need him to say another name. He continued, there's more. He explained that retirement contributions for hourly employees had quietly been reduced while executive bonuses increased. Several accounting classifications didn't make sense. Nothing screamed criminal, but together, the picture was alarming. When I hung up, I sat alone in my kitchen for almost 20 minutes. I wasn't thinking about revenge. I was thinking about Frank Doyle. He'd worked for us since the garage days, 68 years old now, still showing up every morning before sunrise. If Mark really had chosen bonuses over people like Frank, this wasn't just about my marriage anymore. That evening, Emily came over. She stood in my kitchen, twisting her coffee mug between both hands. Mom. I looked at her. I knew. I froze. Knew what? About Natalie. The words barely came out. For almost a year. The room suddenly felt very quiet. Why didn't you tell me? Emily started crying. Dad said you already knew. I didn't. He said your marriage had been over for years, she wiped her face. I thought staying neutral meant I wasn't choosing sides. I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. Sometimes silence chooses for you. I didn't say it out loud, she already knew. The next morning, my phone rang before 8 a.m. It was Rachel. Tom finished reviewing everything. I held my breath. We have enough. For what? She answered calmly, an emergency board meeting. When? She paused just long enough for my stomach to tighten. Tomorrow. 10 a.m. I barely slept the night before the board meeting. Not because I was afraid of Mark, but because I was afraid of myself. At 49, you stop believing every difficult decision has a clean ending. I'd spent 25 years helping build Carter Precision Systems. I knew every hallway, every machine, every employee birthday, and every family emergency we'd quietly helped through. What if removing Mark hurt the people I was trying to protect? That question stayed with me until sunrise. I stood in my kitchen with a mug of coffee I never drank. The migraine from the day before had faded, but my stomach felt tight. Around 7:30 a.m., my phone buzzed. Rachel, I know what you're thinking, she said before I spoke. Do you? You're wondering whether this is becoming personal. I looked out the window at the maple tree my father had planted the year Emily was born. It is personal. It is? Rachel didn't argue. But that doesn't make it wrong. I stayed quiet. She continued, if Tom's report were clean, I'd tell you to walk away. And if it isn't, then your responsibility isn't to Mark. She paused. It's to the company. An hour later, I drove to the office. The familiar Carter Precision Systems sign came into view, and for a moment, I remembered the first building we'd rented, 8,000 square feet, one loading dock, and one coffee maker that barely worked. Back then, Mark and I celebrated every new customer with takeout pizza. We weren't competing with each other, we were surviving together. That memory almost made me turn the car around. Almost. When I entered the lobby, I noticed people behaving normally. Someone laughed near the vending machines, forklift alarms echoed faintly from the production floor, and the receptionist answered phones. Nobody knew what was about to happen upstairs. I hoped they never would, at least not the ugly details. Companies survive bad leadership, they don't survive constant public drama. I took the elevator to the executive floor. Rachel and Tom were already there. Tom looked exhausted. I reviewed everything twice, he said quietly. You won't find mistakes. I never thought you would. He nodded. I wish I had. Rachel handed me a folder. This isn't your fight unless you decide it is. I appreciated that. Nobody was pushing me. Nobody was promising revenge, only accountability. At 9:10 a.m., another board member arrived, Stephen Cole. He'd served on the board nearly as long as Rachel. He greeted me politely. I wasn't expecting to see you today. I imagine Mark wasn't either. He smiled faintly. I'll be honest, I'm uncomfortable mixing divorce and corporate governance. So am I. That seemed to surprise him. I don't want revenge, Stephen. Then why are we here? I looked him straight in the eye. Because if Tom's report had been about anyone else, we'd still be having this meeting. He considered that for a few seconds, then simply nodded. It wasn't full agreement, but it wasn't a dismissal either. At 9:40 a.m., my attorney called. The judge signed the settlement. I closed my eyes. So, it's official. Yes. And the title company has authorization to close on the property. Thank you, I whispered. I stared at my phone for a long moment. The Carmel house was finally mine alone, not because I'd tricked anyone, but because Mark had chosen something else. During mediation, he'd insisted on keeping the downtown condominium, most of our brokerage account, and his boat. He'd called my parents' old house a money pit. He wanted liquidity, he wanted convenience. He'd laughed when his own attorney suggested thinking twice. She can have the old place. Those had been his exact words. Now the closing attorney was waiting only for final confirmation from Ben Foster. For the first time in months, I allowed myself one slow breath. At 9:55 a.m., my phone buzzed again with an email. Subject: Shareholder Proxy Authorization. I frowned. The sender was Mark's executive assistant, routine, professional, exactly the same format I'd received every year. Please sign at your earliest convenience. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because habit is powerful. For 17 years, I would have opened the attachment, signed it without reading, and sent it back. My hand actually reached for the mouse. Then I stopped. The date, today's date, 10 a.m. board meeting. I immediately forwarded the email to Rachel. A few seconds later, she replied, "Thank you. Do not respond." That one email told the board something crucial. Mark wasn't trying to steal my vote, he simply assumed he'd always have it. Sometimes arrogance doesn't announce itself. Sometimes it quietly expects yesterday to repeat forever. At virtue of 10 a.m., Mark walked into the boardroom, same confident smile, same expensive suit, coffee in one hand. He looked around the room. "Morning, everyone." Nobody answered immediately. Then he noticed me. His smile faded. "What are you doing here?" "I was invited." He laughed once. This is a board meeting. Rachel closed the leather folder in front of her. It is? So why is Diane sitting here? Rachel answered calmly, because she's a director and a voting shareholder. Mark blinked. Fine, he shrugged, sitting at the opposite end of the table. Let me get this over with. Natalie wasn't inside. She waited outside, probably expecting Mark to introduce her later, as our next chief operating officer. Rachel looked around the room. Before we begin, I'd like everyone to confirm they've received Tom Alvarez's audit summary. Papers rustled. Everyone nodded. Mark looked irritated. What audit? Tom slid a folder toward him. You'll want to read page 4. Mark flipped through the first few pages. His expression changed. What is this? Rachel answered, our agenda. He looked back down. Executive compensation, conflict of interest, travel reimbursement, unauthorized bonus approvals. The room grew quiet, even the air conditioner suddenly sounded louder. Mark looked directly at me. This is because of the divorce. No, Rachel interrupted gently. This meeting is about corporate governance. Mark leaned back. You've got to be kidding. The evidence speaks for itself. Rachel remained calm. Tom cleared his throat. Mr. Carter, the accounting records show executive retention bonuses approved without full board authorization. They were legal. Perhaps, Tom nodded. But they weren't properly disclosed. Mark looked toward me again. You planned this. I met his eyes. I planned to tell the truth. His voice hardened. You're willing to destroy the company because I left you. For a second, the room disappeared. I saw us 25 years earlier, covered in machine grease, eating cold pizza on folding chairs, laughing because we'd finally landed our first big contract. Then I came back to the present. No, I spoke quietly. I'm trying to stop you from destroying the company we built. The company we built. Nobody spoke. Rachel placed one final document in front of every director, then looked at me. I suddenly realized this wasn't the end of my marriage, it was the beginning of whatever came next. Nobody reached for a pen, not right away. The silence inside the boardroom felt heavier than any argument I'd ever heard. Mark looked from one face to another, searching for someone who would smile, crack a joke, or tell him this was all some misunderstanding. Nobody did. Mr. Carter, before the board considers any motion, you're entitled to respond to the findings, Rachel said. Mark straightened in his chair. He slid Tom's report aside, as though it were nothing more than a restaurant menu. The relationship between Natalie and me is personal, he glanced at me before continuing. My marriage had already broken down. The board isn't evaluating your marriage, Rachel noted. Then why bring it up? Because the relationship wasn't disclosed while executive compensation decisions affecting Miss Green were being made. Mark folded his arms. She earned every dollar. Tom opened another folder. No one is questioning her work performance. We are questioning the approval process. He pushed several documents toward the directors. 3 retention bonuses were approved without full board review. The Aspen resort trip was categorized as vendor development, the receipts show no scheduled vendor meetings, and the hotel reservation lists 1 suite. Mark's jaw tightened. You've been digging through my private life. No, we've been reviewing company records, Rachel answered. That distinction mattered. This wasn't about catching a cheating husband, it was about whether the company's leadership had stopped respecting the rules everyone else followed. Mark leaned forward. This company doubled in value under my leadership. It also belongs to its shareholders, Rachel said. And to 180 employees, I added quietly. He turned toward me. So now you're pretending this is about them. No, I've spent 25 years worrying about them. The words came easier than I expected. I remember calling machinists during the recession to promise payroll would still clear on Friday. I remember sitting with Frank Doyle's wife in the hospital. I remember telling employees we'd find a way through COVID before we even knew how. I looked around the room. I don't remember asking for credit. Mark laughed once. Bull. I shook my head. I asked for honesty. The room fell silent again. Rachel placed a printed resolution in front of every director. The first motion concerns Miss Natalie Green. The vote was quick. Her pending promotion to Chief Operating Officer was withdrawn, administrative leave pending an independent review. The motion carried unanimously. Mark looked stunned. He'd expected disagreement, he'd found unity. The second motion concerns Mr. Carter's position as Chief Executive Officer, Rachel continued. The recommendation before the board is removal as CEO, effective immediately, and appointment of David Reynolds as Interim Chief Executive Officer pending a permanent search. Mark stood up so quickly his chair rolled backward. This is insane. Nobody answered. He looked directly at Stephen Cole. You've known me 20 years. Stephen sighed. I have. But I can't ignore the governance issues. Mark stared at him, then at another director, then another. Finally, he looked at me. This is your doing. No, Mark. This is the board's decision, Rachel spoke firmly. Please cast your votes. One by one, hands went up. Yes. 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 Stephen hesitated, then slowly raised his hand. Rachel counted quietly. The motion passes. Effective immediately, you're removed as Chief Executive Officer of Carter Precision Systems. No applause, no dramatic music, just silence. Mark remained standing, his face pale. You can't do this. Rachel folded the signed resolution. We already did. She slid the document toward me. As chair, I need one additional signature acknowledging the shareholder certification. My fingers ached as I picked up the pen. The arthritis in my right hand chose that exact moment to remind me it existed. I almost smiled, life had a strange sense of timing. I signed. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I wanted the record to be accurate. Mark stared at the signature, 25 years reduced to one line of ink. A facilities manager knocked softly on the open door. He'd worked with us for nearly 15 years. His voice was almost apologetic. Mr. Carter, whenever you're ready, I'll help you collect your personal belongings. Not security officers, not humiliation, just a man doing his job. That somehow made it even sadder. An hour later, I walked out of the building alone. The summer air felt warmer than I'd expected. Instead of relief, I felt deeply tired. My phone rang, it was my attorney. Diane, the closing is complete. Ben Foster now owns the Carmel property. I thanked him and ended the call. Sitting inside my car, I'd imagined this moment dozens of times thinking I'd feel victorious. Instead, I missed my father. I wished he could have seen that the little house he'd loved so much would remain standing instead of being torn down. Ben had promised to restore it, not replace it. Dad would have liked that. I drove to Carmel because there was one last box of personal things I'd left behind. When I pulled onto the street, Ben Foster stood talking with his realtor. Then another car stopped, Mark. He climbed out without saying a word. A minute later, Lorraine opened the front door, spotting me immediately. Her face hardened, and she planted her cane across the walkway. Don't ever set foot in my house again. Actually, Lorraine. I took a slow breath. The sale closed this morning. And your son isn't the CEO anymore. Ben quietly stepped forward. I'm Ben Foster, the new owner. He held out the final paperwork showing Mark's signature and the closing confirmation. Lorraine grabbed the papers, her eyes darting across the lines before looking at Mark. "You signed this?" Mark rubbed the back of his neck. "I didn't think." "No," she interrupted, her voice cracking. "You didn't." For a second, she looked much older than 74. A sheriff's deputy pulled up. A neighbor had called after hearing the shouting. After reviewing the papers, the deputy handed them back. The property legally changed ownership this morning. You have 72 hours to remove your belongings." Ben offered to help with movers, but Lorraine just stood there, clutching 3 paint samples under her arm: white, gray, cream. She had been planning a new kitchen for a house that was never going to be hers. As I walked to my car with my last box, Mark followed me. "Diane, please. I need you to fix this. With the board. You still have influence. I can't help you. I'm asking for my job. And I'm asking for respect," I said softly, climbing into my car. He looked away, still unable to understand what he'd actually lost. 3 weeks later, an invitation arrived in my mailbox: Carter Precision Systems Annual Employee Appreciation Banquet. At the bottom was a handwritten note from Rachel: "Please come." When I walked into the ballroom at the Indiana State Museum that evening, the room was filled with people who had worked beside me for decades. Then I saw Mark standing alone near the back wall in a charcoal suit, not at the head table, just standing there. Rachel walked over, smiling warmly. "I'm glad you came. Tonight isn't about him." She touched my arm. "I have one favor to ask: just stay until the end." Dinner passed quietly. Frank Doyle eventually sat down beside me, his hair almost completely white. "Good to see you, kid. You're going to like tonight." After dessert, Rachel stepped onto the stage. A large screen lit up behind her with old photographs: the original garage, Mark at 28 beside our first used milling machine, me sitting on a folding chair with invoices, and Emily as a toddler asleep in a cardboard box while I finished payroll. Rachel spoke into the microphone. "For many years, our company history recognized only one founder. That history was incomplete." The next slide appeared. Founders: Mark Carter, Diane Whitmore Carter. The room became very quiet. "Some people build companies by making sales," Rachel said, looking around the ballroom. "Others build companies by making sure every employee gets paid, every supplier gets called, and every problem gets solved before anyone else notices. Tonight, we are correcting the record." Frank Doyle stood up first. Within seconds, the entire room followed, erupting into a standing ovation. People I'd hired, people whose families I'd known for decades, all applauding. Rachel motioned me to the stage. Trembling, I walked up to the microphone. I had a speech prepared. I laughed softly through tears, but I guess I don't anymore. I never wanted recognition, I only wanted the truth. My father used to tell me that integrity is what you do when nobody is watching. This company was never built by one person, it was built by welders, machinists, accountants, engineers, and families who believed this place was worth sacrificing for. Thank you for letting me be part of that. As the applause surged once more, Frank came up to hug me. "You forgot something." "What?" He smiled softly. "My wife's surgery, you paid for it. And you never told anyone." I smiled. It wasn't anyone else's business. Frank turned toward several younger employees standing nearby. When Linda needed heart surgery back in 2007, the insurance hadn't kicked in yet. He looked back at me. Diane arranged an advance out of company funds. We approved it through payroll, I interrupted gently. He grinned. She also drove casseroles to our house for 2 weeks. I felt my face turn warm. You don't have to tell everyone that. Yes, he nodded firmly, looking around the room. I do. Mark knew how to grow the business. He pointed gently toward me. She knew how to take care of the people inside it. Nobody applauded that time. They simply nodded. Some truths don't need noise. As the evening wound down, I noticed Mark standing near the ballroom exit. People weren't avoiding him, they simply weren't gathering around him anymore. He waited until the room had mostly emptied before walking over. We stood facing each other, no lawyers, no judges, no board members, just two people who had once believed they'd grow old together. I owe you an apology, he said quietly. I waited. I should have given you more credit. For a moment, I almost accepted that. Then I realized something. Credit wasn't what had been missing. I looked him in the eye. You should have given me respect. He lowered his head. I know. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, he asked softly, do you think you'll ever forgive me? I thought about that carefully. I already have. He looked surprised. But forgiveness isn't permission to come back. He nodded slowly. I understand. Whether he truly did, I couldn't say for sure. Emily found me outside overlooking the canal. She wrapped her arms around me without saying anything. After a while, she whispered, I'm proud of you, Mom. I kissed the top of her head. I'm proud of you, too. She smiled. For what? For finally realizing you don't have to carry everyone else's arguments. She laughed softly. I'm still learning. So am I. Life became surprisingly ordinary after that. I bought a small ranch-style home in Zionsville, no stairs, a modest garden, and enough room for Emily whenever she visited. I started consulting for smaller manufacturing companies a few days each month, just enough to stay busy, but not enough to lose my weekends again. Ben Foster occasionally sent photos, as he restored my parents' old house. He kept the original hardwood floors, the front porch, and even the kitchen cabinets Lorraine had wanted to replace. Dad would have smiled. 3 months later, a handwritten envelope arrived in my mailbox. The return address surprised me, Lorraine. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Diane. I was wrong about the house. I was wrong about your place in the company. I don't expect you to answer, I only wanted you to know. Lorraine. I didn't write back immediately. A few weeks later, I mailed her a simple card wishing her well after hearing about her physical therapy. Compassion didn't erase the past, it simply meant I no longer wanted to carry bitterness into whatever years I had left. Looking back now, people sometimes ask whether winning felt as satisfying as I'd imagined. The truth? Not exactly. Watching Mark lose his title didn't heal me. Selling the house didn't heal me. Being recognized at the banquet didn't heal me. What healed me was finally believing I didn't have to earn respect from people who had already decided not to give it. Growing older teaches you something success never can: peace is worth protecting. Your dignity is worth protecting. And it is never too late to stop apologizing for knowing your own value. If you've ever had to rebuild your life after someone underestimated you, I hope you know you're not alone. Thank you for spending this time with me today, and I truly hope the people in your life recognize your worth before it's too late.